everyone. Good middle of the week, and welcome to another conversation from our October series. This is a topic that I was very much looking forward to address. We have an amazing lineup of speakers. My name is Minola Jacques. I will be your co-host for today. I'm a journalist by trade. I'm a change manager by choice and an absolute Hacking HR supporter by calling. We have Jessa backstage taking super good care of us. So if you enjoy the conversation, please make sure you say a warm thank you to Jessa as well. And before we bring our speakers on the stage, I just want to encourage you to use the comments, use the chat. Do let us know where you're calling in from. I already see that we have people in the audience from literally everywhere. And it always is such a joy and a privilege to know that you take time and curiosity to join us from all over the world. So Jessa, please do help me bringing up our speakers on stage. And what a wonderful screen we have today. I will try to make this very short hour full of value, and I am just so privileged to have a front row seat in this conversation. So without further ado, let's get into it. We will start off with a lovely round of introductions. And the drill is quite simple. What I will do, I will pass the e-mic around as you appear on my screen clockwise. And I will ask you to just shortly introduce yourselves. And also do share with us what exactly from the topic of inclusive leadership, which is our topic today, makes it so meaningful to you that you committed time and energy and your insights to be here today. So Evelyn, so good to see you. Welcome. You're on mute.
Of course. Story of my life. Hello, everyone. For me, inclusive leadership was very important simply because I feel like it's the foundation for us to move forward in any organization. And to be an inclusive leader, it really says a lot about your strategy for leadership. We can have a lot of leaders doing a lot of things, but if they lack inclusivity, then you'll come against a lot of problems and challenges going forward. So leaders who have a great meter of being inclusive, definitely for me, are better leaders for organizations.
Thank you very much. Rocky, good to see you. Welcome.
Hi, it's great to see you all too. It's so great to be here with you and Evelyn and Jeanette. I'm really excited. And, I think when we think about leadership and inclusivity, we often think of those as separate competencies and separate initiatives. And I really struggle with that because when you're a leader, you have a responsibility to all of your team and you have a responsibility to everyone in your org. And you can't keep up with that responsibility unless your behaviors and your actions are inclusive. We really change the experience of our team members throughout the life cycle of their career with their organizations based on how we treat people. And if we're not treating people inclusively, we're not doing our job as leaders. Individuals don't quit companies, they quit leaders. And so we need to get this right.
Thank you so very much. And Jeanette, good to have you with us in this conversation. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. Jeanette Robles, Global Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Archer Daniels Midland, which is ADM. And I think it's such a great question. And for me, I've been in the DEI space for upwards of 20 years. And I've seen in my experience, and I've experienced myself, the difference between an inclusive leader and a leader that is not inclusive. And the level of productivity, the level of psychological safety. I mean, I know we're going to go over a lot of these terms during this conversation, but really just resonates throughout the organization when you have a leader that can bring everyone in, that shows and displays and demonstrates that emotional empathy, that is able to have the intelligence to kind of navigate and have situational leadership. It's all mixed into an inclusive leader. If you take all those behaviors, as Rocky said, and Evelyn alluded to as well, if you pull them all together, it really comes down to an inclusive leader that demonstrates all these behaviors. And for me, there's no way to have a great DEI program and strategy without that being at the core of leadership behaviors.
Thank you all so very much. And already a full bag of conversation candies from this round alone, and we will unpack many of the pointers. Now, especially for this topic, I would encourage everybody in the audience listening and watching us now, do consider these questions as much yours as it is our panelists, because we do expect to uncover a wealth of nuances and interpretations across cultures, across geographies, across generations, across all our intersectionalities. And I can't think of another topic where these are so meaningful to really uncover and speak about. So please drop us your comments, your ideas, and build your own conversations. Now, before we jump straight into why and how and also how not, let's sit a little bit and unpack this inclusive leadership. And I don't want to go straight into the skills and capabilities, but you all mentioned behaviors. So what are the behavioral markers of inclusive leadership? How do we recognize inclusive leadership? How does it sound like? How does it feel like? And how does it look like? And what I will do, I will ask Rocky if you can be our pioneer in this round of answers. And then Evelyn and Jeanette, please unmute yourselves and build your conversation. So Rocky, please.
Yeah, I really believe that the foundation of inclusive leadership comes from humility, transparency, and curiosity, right? If you're going to be inclusive leader, it means that you have to be respectful of the multiple dimensions of diversity that surround you every day. And while you may not understand it all, which is where the humility comes in, you have to have the ability to ask questions and to be willing to make mistakes and to be willing to say, you know what, I don't know what it's like to be X or Y, but I want to learn, and can you teach me? And so that takes an amount of humility, right? There's curiosity involved. You have to be genuinely curious about what the different dimensions of diversity are. You have to be curious enough to recognize that there are multiple dimensions of diversity that go beyond what we are always constantly talking about, and gender and race. Now we're starting to have conversations about neurodiversity and accessibility. And then we have to recognize that there is the intersectionality of it all. You know, people may look at Evelyn and I'm going to do this because on my screen we're like this, right? People may look at Evelyn and I and go, oh, they're both Black women, so surely I can just treat them the same. But you don't know what our lived experience is. You don't know what other dimensions of diversity we have. You don't know how we show up unless you're willing to invest the time to be able to do that. And so I think it's about being curious. It's about being transparent and saying, this is what I know, this is what I don't know. It's also about being transparent enough so people know that you're an inclusive leader, that you're genuinely and authentically trying, that you don't pretend to know it all, but that you're here and that you will listen. And so I think that sets the stage, and I'm sure both Evelyn and Jeanette will build on that perfectly, but that's where I think it all starts.
Thank you, Rocky.
I couldn't agree more with Rocky. I'll piggyback off of some of the things she said. I wholeheartedly agree. Transparency is key, as well as empathy and kindness. And I use kindness over niceness because I tell people all the time, I'm kind, not nice. I don't want to give you false hope with niceness, but I want to do the right things and be genuine. So kindness. The other thing I'll also agree with was curiosity. I think that a leader definitely has to want to learn and want to be a part of the solution. Again, to what Rocky said, even when they don't necessarily understand sometimes what's going on, but they still have that innate curiosity to want to learn and want to do better when they do fall short, because we're all human. Everyone falls short. And I think the other word that I would say is a behavioral marker is someone who's transformative. They're not just looking to, do today, right? They're looking to do what works today, tomorrow, and so forth. And then how can we set up to be adaptable through those changes of tomorrow? So those would be some of the markers that I would add on to or embellish upon what Rocky had already said.
Mm.
And just to build upon that, I it's hard to even build upon that because it's so robust, right? Everything that Rocky and Evelyn said. But as we look at inclusive leadership, and I think someone actually mentioned this in the comments as well, is also looking at what are exclusive behaviors, and the antithesis to that is our inclusive behaviors, right? If we look at those, I think Rocky mentioned diversity, right? An exclusive leader shuns diversity. They're threatened by it. They don't understand it. They don't want to care to understand it. Don't want to expand on their learning. Where an inclusive leader says, I'm going to continue growing and I'm going to continue to learn more about that which I am not familiar with, that which I am afraid to become more familiar with. It's taking that step out. And again, that word courage, taking the courage to be able to ask the question and be able to say, I don't know enough about that. Can you help me with that? Or how can I learn more? Or can you point me to a resource that will be helpful to me, and not always burden the person with having to teach you, but saying, I'm going to take it upon myself to make sure that I stay curious and continue to learn that. Other behaviors, forcing an opinion versus bringing others in and asking opinion and exploring those areas which you don't know more about. It's like, it's not just being autocratic. It's not just being dictator in your leadership style, but saying, I'm going to bring people in who I hired to make me better and to make the organization better, and trust them to be able to give you that feedback. And then hopefully implementing some of that feedback as you look at the collective. And then I would say in that same vein, bringing people in versus keeping a distance. Oftentimes you'll see leaders, in order to be inclusive, you have to be close to your people. You have to ask the questions. You have to be aware, self-aware enough and aware of them and their own personalities that you can pick up on changes and anything that you might see and pick up in a room. If I notice that Rocky is always giving feedback and always willing to contribute in a room, and today Rocky's not saying much of anything and contributing, there is something wrong there. As a leader, I need to be able to pick up on those things if I want to be inclusive and I want to make my team feel like I'm pulling them and drawing them in. Mm-hmm. And then, lastly, and I think that kind of pulls it all together, is encouraging that discussion. If your people are too quiet in a meeting, then there's some self-reflection that's needed there. Am I imposing too much in this meeting? Am I speaking first? Am I not allowing the space in the room for those that I'm leading to be able to speak up, to say, to disagree, to allow for some positive discussion within the room in order for that feeling of safety to be able to do that to take place?
Mm. Well, listening to your answers, you reminded me of this wonderful, wonderful quote that says that I would rather be excluded for whom I include than included for whom I exclude. And I would really invite you to stay just a little bit in this energy of what inclusive leadership is, but with a spin. If we decouple leadership from hierarchy, which is our reflex association with leadership, and we talk, senior executives, what is inclusive leadership across the organization? And especially, how can people from within the HR function that are not necessarily leaders by mandate or by role, how can they be inclusive leaders of that organization? I also saw a question, like where do we start? So we don't all start out as leaders, by role. How do we still role model inclusive leadership from wherever we are in the organization? And Evelyn, why don't you give it a go?
Yeah, I would say definitely everyone can mirror those behaviors we just stated at all levels. Doesn't matter what level you are. Of course, when you're in the leadership or team management executive, you have probably better impact or influence, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can't mimic or demonstrate those behaviors that we previously discussed. I think ways that HR and everyday employees can make an impact, I think would be especially in that space of curiosity, empathy, and kindness. Is so often one of the things I always tell people, at least at my team, is lead with positive intentions, regardless of whatever you're going to get to the end result, right? So if an employee's, been a pain and haven't been showing up to work, if you lead with positive intentions, you could find out this employee had something going on, or they just simply are a bad employee and just doesn't want to come to work. But you started off with a place of kindness and empathy with that employee. So therefore, your intentions were genuine. And I think if everyone did that, not just, give your, I tell employees always say, give your managers the grace that you want them to give you, because they also are people, right? And sometimes we tend to forget that. And so as I'm coaching my managers, I coach employees too, right? It's like, sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say. So be mindful of how you ask things. Maybe you want this, but let's see how we can frame that so that the person can hear your wants versus hearing how you're saying it. And so those would be some things that I would encourage everyday employees, not just leaders and managers, to recognize and to implement in their day to day.
I'd love to build on that, Evelyn, because I think part of what we look at and leadership and leaders doesn't necessarily mean that you have direct reports, right? You can definitely be a leader and a motivator and an influencer within a space and not have a single person that reports to you, and what does that really look like in a room? Allyship, the word allyship is thrown around, right? And sometimes I think we undervalue because it's so used, right? It's that but allyship is truly about the support that you're giving other people in a room, as a colleague, as someone that's on a committee. And a prime example that I'll give on that, and it doesn't always mean that you have to be confrontational about it either. I remember being in a room and having we had a leader who just kept repeating something that another colleague, a female colleague, kept saying, and in their own words. And it was just like, okay, we're doing the mansplaining thing, we're doing the taking credit, and very simply turning and saying, you know what, I'm so glad you put an exclamation point onto Rocky's point. What she said earlier about that really resonated with me. So I'm so glad that you're in agreement. I didn't have to call him out. I was drawing him in and saying, you know what, we're all on the same page. But giving Rocky that credit and being able to uplift her and for her intelligence and what she contributed in the room is ever so important. And then I would also say it's part of that practice, right? I've started meetings where, you don't have to be the leader in the room to say, hey, love to do a check-in. Why don't you throw an emoji into the chat so we can do a check-in. And part of that is saying sometimes you're a little surprised at how honest people are about how they're feeling right then at that moment. You may get a sad face, may get a mad face, and if they want to share, they will. But that allows you to kind of get a pulse in the room as well. So just other behaviors that we can kind of implement and also show in terms of allyship to others that have nothing to do with whether or not you're the particular people leader in the room.
Jeanette, I've never heard someone do that so eloquently. I hope that everyone here takes that piece away from them, because it's always uncomfortable when you see something happening and you're wondering, how do I bring a light to this without ostracizing people? So, I want to take this from a different perspective, but I also want to answer a question that's in the chat. I think someone asked for resources on how you do this. For me, if you're really at the beginning or even the middle of this journey of inclusive leadership, go grab my friend Jennifer Brown's book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader, because it talks about this continuum, and it talks about this is not a destination. This is an ongoing journey, right? I am in the process of writing a book for small to mid-sized business leaders on how to build their strategies. And there's a couple of behaviors that we include for the HR people. And so Manila, I heard you ask a question about how does HR leadership show up and be inclusive leaders. And so I think what HR can really do is start at the beginning and kind of assess their own skills and abilities, understand where they need to do more work that they can model, and start there and be honest with an honest assessment, not only for where the organization is, but for where they are. I clearly believe that for leaders to be inclusive, you have to connect to both the human imperatives in the business, which is where we focus time on today, but you also have to connect to the business imperatives of the business. And so when you're able to do that, that's where I see sustainable action. So I would also encourage HR leaders to look at the organizational values of the company and to look at the goals of the company and really define how does inclusive leadership help support those values, and to define the why behind how it supports goals. I also would say any great leader prepares for the challenges. So practice and prepare for the challenges. This work takes courage. You're gonna screw something up. You're gonna say the wrong thing. You're gonna forget a dimension of diversity that you shouldn't. You're gonna mispronounce someone's name. You're gonna get into a disagreement, and you need to prepare for the challenges along the way. And then finally, find your support system. This work can be exhausting. And I don't say that in a way to get, like, none of us need, sympathy because we've chosen to do this work. But when you take it on deeply, you feel it, it's heart and head work, and it impacts you if you do it authentically. And so for me, what's critical for me to be a really good inclusive leader, especially from a people perspective, is to have a core group of like-minded people who understand the work that I do and are part of my support system.
This is absolutely so wonderful. And I do want to ask you all to let's unpack a little bit. What does it mean, inclusive leadership, and linking it to business results? And I am under the influence of two very recent conversations, Hacking HR conversations of last week. One was a panel touching on DEI. And we had a wonderful, wonderful speaker. And at one point, they were like, I can't believe that in this day and age, we are still in a situation to talk about why inclusion and belonging is relevant for the business. But we are, and that's a lot of people's realities. And the second one is a conversation about the language of business and HR learning to speak the language of business, which oftentimes the most relevant or the information that business leaders are most willing to listen to is the language of analytics. So how can we bridge these two conversations, inclusive leadership and why is it good for the business? And do you have any tips up your sleeve around inclusion and belonging, meaningful data and analytics that you use in your conversations with leaders?
I'll just start just because there's a couple of stats that I have off the top of my head. And yes, depending on the audience, but here's the interesting part of it. Like you, Manola, I have publicly said, if companies ask me to justify a business case for diversity, then they're probably are not aligned with where I am in their journey, right? And so I get that. Like a lot of us would like to believe that you should do it because it's the right damn thing to do. Like it really should be that simple. However, what that then relegates DEI to is a human imperative initiative only. And then it gets shoved to the side. And then it's very easy to happen what's happening now, that resources are getting eroded because it's not seen as a core strategic initiative that's part of the key objectives of the business. So here's one of those things that makes this really interesting to me from a business perspective, right? One is in 2044, the people who are now considered to be majority will be minority. So here's the question. If you need people to run your business and your culture is not set up to be inclusive and equitable and diverse, then how are you going to do business when the majority of people are diverse? That's a really key issue that gets people's attention. You won't be able to have the number of people who do the job. If you look at the stats, anywhere I've seen numbers as high as 85% of incoming candidates, regardless of how they identify, expect their companies to have diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging initiatives. And especially our newer generations are not going to tolerate the homogenous old school thoughts and behaviors. If you look at the statistics behind productivity and performance, McKinsey, Deloitte, all of these companies have a ton of statistics. If you look at the statistics behind financials, it's shown that diverse companies perform even higher if you look at engagement, if you look at retention. But here's this crazy stat that always sticks in my heart, right? There's a lot of us who haven't stepped back, who haven't stepped back on our diversity initiatives, and we're still saying it's important, yet 50% of candidates, Matheson did a survey and said 50% of candidates who identify as underrepresented feel like just being them gives them a disadvantage in the recruiting process. 62% in that survey said that they had experienced bias in the recruiting process. There you go. We could go on and on, but there you go.
Thank you. Evelyn.
Couldn't agree more with you, Rocky. I think one of the things, sorry, just want to make sure I was taking some notes while you were talking. One of the things that I definitely address with my team is making sure that DEIB initiatives, people initiatives, are harmonious with strategic initiatives. And when I say harmonious, not separate. So they're not just people. They're not this. They're all ingrained in what our overarching strategy is as a business. And so when that's ingrained, it's hard to to Rocky's point, devalue or take resources away from it because it's all inclusive of the overarching strategy for the company. And the other thing is when you're an inclusive leader, you already understand that investing in your people are critical, is critical for the business. And so therefore you're already ingraining and developing strategies and goals that align with that. When you're not inclusive, that's when you have to build those justification and have those metrics and have those numbers. And another thing for my team, one of the things I push is using the data to support the narrative that you already know. And if the data doesn't support the narrative that you already know, because we're all professionals, we all pretty much sometimes have that feeling or know because we've been doing it a while. But sometimes the data doesn't support it. And if it doesn't, then we need to identify why it doesn't. Or maybe it's not the issue that we should be addressing. It's something else, and the data is supporting that. And I think sometimes in HR, we're scary of data because it's a lot, right? And sometimes we want to I don't want to say avoid it, but necessarily work around it because we already, see the pitfalls. But when we start to ingrain it and use it for what it is, it will make, us being partners to the business so much easier. And I couldn't agree more with a lot of what Rocky was stating is, removing those biases, right? When we have the data to show, here's why we're having trainings on unconscious bias, because, if 85% of our, candidates are feeling like this, we're having a disconnect in bringing talent. If we can't bring talent, we can't, produce, give better productivity. We can't get better productivity. We cannot, grow as a business.
I'll just place an exclamation point on both of them, both Rocky and Evelyn. I think it's everything has been touched upon, right? But what I would say is that as we're looking at the statistics that you can pull in and the data that's already available out there is so much research that will tell us that teams that are, Google did a huge study on psychological safety on teams, right? And how that impacts teams and whether or not that impacts productivity, innovation, how you treat your customers. All of this data is available internally. It's just a matter of putting it in the right boxes to be able to show which part do you want me to focus on? Do you want me to focus on if we don't retain and our people are not happy and they don't feel like they're included in this space, what the cost of having to replace people year in and year out, and especially those high tech, high intellectual property type of positions that you have within your company, all the way to your contributors, whether that be labor or how people are feeling on the plant floor. So we have every single type of role within our company. And at least in our particular company, whether large or small, this is an impact. When losing one person and all their institutional knowledge is going to impact business. It's going to impact the team that has to pick up the slack until someone new is hired. When we're looking at productivity and how that slows productivity, that is something that our leaders are going to listen to. If we talk about innovation, all those ideas coming to the table, people feeling like they can bring those ideas to the table, we can talk about that as well. And then not only our future customers, but our existing customers. Who are we touching? Who are we trying to reach? How diverse is that population that we're trying to reach? And if you're not able to speak their language, guess what? They're going to go and speak to someone else who can. So if we want to look at this data, the data that we look at can be engagement data, which is our sentiment data internally. It could be our customer focus, where our customers are going and where they're staying. And it can be the amount of innovation that's being created with this company, whether that's new product development or whether that's efficiency on the team. So I would say exclamation point on all of that, but there is enough data. It's really just what direction do you want to point to?
How wonderful. So we are already a few minutes in the second half of our conversation, and I would like to take a few seconds just to welcome everybody who joined a little bit later. I was especially happy to see people from my home country of Romania. So that was very nice. And also some of my neighbors from Switzerland at the moment. So welcome everybody. Also, a warm encouragement. Do drop any resources that you found particularly helpful in the comments, and help our community have these resources at hand. So whether you have books, as Rocky already mentioned, whether you have articles, whether you have anything that can be referenced with a link, that would be absolutely wonderful. And also, in case you need to drop off a little bit early, or you joined a little bit later, or you want to just go back and revisit the nugget of wisdom from our panelists, the session is recorded, and you can find it on our hackinghrlab.io platform, together with all the recordings from our series. Now, I was kind of pacing myself before asking a quite typical question, like, what are the learning and development opportunities? But then I saw a question dropped in the comments that I do want to acknowledge and bring into our conversation. How can we become inclusive leaders by exercising this curiosity? And you already mentioned, ask people. I don't know what it is or how it feels like to be this or that. Teach me. So how much of this is curiosity? What are the curiosity behaviors? And what are some intrusive behaviors? So I myself witnessed conversations, where someone even said, at the end of the day, it's also your responsibility to get educated. Yeah. And at the same time, I do want to be mindful of the fact that there are cultures where questions, whether asking them or receiving them, is not as comfortable as in other cultures. So what is this fine balance between asking to learn and feeling potentially being perceived as intrusive or not mindful enough? Evelyn, I saw you unmuted.
I will definitely say openness and genuineness are critical in that. Being genuine in your acts, but being open enough to understand and hear when someone tells you that it may be intrusive or that they don't feel comfortable, and being okay and not taking it personal that, they're that this is offending them, that it's, it's not about how it's making you feel. It's about, you're asking them a question, you're wondering how it's making them feel. So being open to receiving that. I always, when I ask questions, I'm genuinely curious, and I'll always preface it or end it with, please let me know if this is too, intrusive, or did I overstep, so that gives people an opportunity to address if there's awkwardness or whatever. And then also being very open and being able to see body language, right? The unspoken things, being able, when you see a shift in someone, or if you see them be quiet or shut down, being able to take notice of that and read the room, so that way you can, walk yourself back, or be able to, give them the opportunity or out, so that they feel comfortable in that space. Would be some of the things I would say would help start and be a resource for those conversations, especially those difficult ones.
Jeanette.
I would say, to add to that and kind of building upon that, a great pulse check for yourself, or kind of like a self check when you're going to ask someone a question, is, am I asking them to speak for themselves or speak for their entire community? Yeah. Because what often happens is we want to learn about a particular community, but I am a proud Latina Puerto Rican woman. I cannot speak for the entire Puerto Rican population in the city of Chicago, on the island of Puerto Rico. I have my own opinions. What may offend me and what I may find okay will be very different from the next person. So when asking or trying to educate yourself, make sure that you're educating yourself on that person, what resonates with them, what is going to disturb them, not the entire community. That may often lead to other conversations, and they may tell you, well, as a general rule, what I have found in my community, and they may volunteer that information, but not seeking to educate yourself solely from what this one person tells you, because you may be very misguided as to the entire community. If you want to learn about a community, if you want to learn about a particular topic, read, watch videos, watch the news, educate yourself, get multiple resources, take training. There is no replacement for that. And when you're wanting to build trust with someone, starting with the question, I have a sensitive question. Is it okay if I proceed? Always asking if it's okay with the person before you proceed. And don't ask the question first. Is it okay that I asked you that? Because many of us are kind of trapped within that. What am I supposed to say now that you've just thrown the question out there? And I have to tell you, I don't want to answer that. I may not be in the particular moment where I want to enter into a sensitive conversation. And if you ask me first, I have at least the choice. And that's really what's important about building trust is I feel agency. I feel the choice to be able to say to someone, you know, at this very moment, for whatever other things that are happening in my entire life right now, this is not a good moment for me to discuss that. But, you know, let's set up some time next week so that I can kind of mentally prepare. And if you want, let me know, send me an email, send me a chat of what it is you want to discuss so that I can kind of prepare for that conversation.
Boy, these ladies are hard acts to follow. There's so much brilliancy in that. And Jeanette, I love this piece about giving other people the agency to ask. And so what I would add to what Evelyn and Jeanette said is when you're starting to have a conversation with someone, check your own agenda before you enter that conversation. Why are you doing this? What is your intent in facilitating this conversation? Because people will sense that. So is it because you genuinely want to be a good leader, a better human, a better person? That's probably where you should lead with. Is it because you want to get into a debate and challenge someone about why your side is right and why yours, in their perspective, needs some of your education? People will see that, and that will change the tone of the conversation. Are you being lazy about it? Or as was said earlier by Jeanette, have you done the work? And so I am an open book. I'll answer just about anybody's question about anything. But I really appreciate it when someone comes to me and says, you know what, Rocky, I just saw this, read this, listened to this, and I thought that you might be willing. There's this one piece I don't understand. And if you don't mind, I thought you might be a good person to have this conversation with. And then I would challenge to the point made earlier. None of us can represent a whole dimension of diversity by ourselves. So be careful about why you choose to ask somebody a question. You know, maybe you could just have the question with someone who doesn't even fall into that underrepresented group. What might you learn then? But don't be stereotypical in why you always ask certain people certain questions. So that's what I'd kind of add to that.
I love that. I just had to come up here. It's like, yes, exclamation point. Avoid confirmation bias, please.
Yeah. So I've been trying to word this next question. There are organizations out there who absolutely believe in DEIB at this moment in their life and moving forward. Yet, because of their legacy journeys and because of various other factors. If we look at the representation in their senior leadership teams or boards, they're pretty much uniflavored. Not a lot of diversity there.
Okay.
Yeah. And I have in mind, the very typical example of, white males, but at the same time, I have seen senior leaderships in different industries that are exclusively female or exclusively, again, depending on what element of diversity we have in mind. So what I'm asking is, how can these organizations walk their talk of DEIB without necessarily displacing people from their senior leadership teams?
Whew, that's a one to unpack there. Without displacing people, I think then you look at as people leave, and then you also look at what your board currently has, and then what voices are missing, and probably look at those leaders right underneath them to see how you can bring those voices into decision making. Because it's kind of hard when you say you're not displacing people. So it's like, okay, well, we have to work with what we have. And knowing that, then they have to have honest conversations about where they're lacking, what they're missing, and what voices they, conceivably need, looking at their, their data and their metrics of their employees, right? So if they're 50% women, but all of their leadership is men, then they clearly have a disconnect on what their employees' needs could be, and they need to get some voices. Again, can't get all voices, but get some type of voices to give some women, feedback and things of that nature. I think the other thing, part of that is being honest, and then being clear on what your objectives are.
So I think it's a couple of things here, right? When we're looking at the level of commitment and saying, okay, how committed are you to the journey and taking those steps, and saying, okay, we understand that we have some legacy folks that may be in the, and it's not that you're going to go and say, okay, I'm going to let go this one and I'm going to let go that one to intentionally place somebody else in that spot, right? But as Evelyn said, is roles vacate, do you have a plan for when that role vacates? What is the succession? How far down are you going in that succession plan to be able to say, are we building? And it's taking time to build. And we know these things take time. It won't happen overnight. It might not even happen within 2 to 3 years. But if you're still in the same place 15 years from now, then you really have to question the level of commitment that there's been. The other is also looking for opportunities to expand on the roles that already exist. And I can tell you that firsthand at ADM. Our CEO made a commitment for gender parity within the organization. He also started to look at what roles can we navigate, can we recreate, can we look, where is the space and where do we have potential internal talent that can move into those roles, and what are some of that external talent that we can bring in if we made the space for someone else to come to the table. And he created roles and backfilled roles in order to start creating some of that leveling and that gender parity. But it takes not only intentionality, but bringing all the right stakeholders to the table and making sure that if you're not getting those diverse voices at the table to say, these are some of the ways that we can make this happen, there's no real intentionality behind it. Then it's aspiration, it's a dream, but it's not necessarily, that doesn't make it a plan.
I agree. And we also, you know what? Intentionality is great. Intentionality doesn't even work without investment, and investment in time, investment in dollars, investment in resources to make it happen, right? I personally, when you think about this whole piece, Manola, how you articulated it, I think, is also part of the fear. So this is one of the friction points of DEIB, JA. We can go on with all of the initials, but there are people in roles today whose privilege and power they feel are being threatened because we want to see a more diverse workforce. And that is also making the assumption that diverse talent isn't qualified to be in those roles. Excuse me, the two are not mutually exclusive. You can have great talent that's qualified, that's diverse talent, and you can also invest in building it. But so I think a lot of times we over index on the recruiting piece of it, and we don't think about the rest of the cycle. One of my favorite leaders, recruiting leaders in the industry, said to us once, "I can't recruit your way out of the problem." And in the same way, you can't just pluck somebody out of their role and replace them, but there has to be a strategy as we look through the talent management life cycle. So from the very moment you hire diverse talent, okay, so you're lucky, you got more talent in the funnel, we've got more talent through. How are we onboarding them from day one? What is that experience like? What is the rest of the organization responsible for helping them grow and develop? What's the performance management cycle like? Like, here's the key. If I want to develop someone, I want them to grow with our organization. I want to be able to put them in a high potential program. I want them to be in a succession plan. It starts with how I'm treating them in the performance management cycle, and how I may be even looking at particular people to be even more intentional about what we do through the performance management cycle. What's our learning and how is our learning and development strategies aligned with our DEIB strategies, and how are they connected, and how are the investment working to get us past that good intentions towards actionable outcomes? Jeanette talked about the succession planning. I think all of this falls into retention. And then here's a crazy thing that we often miss. So now someone's offboarding. How are we treating them in the offboarding process? What are we learning in the exit interview? Do we have boomerang and alumni programs? Because you know what? Maybe that person needs to go someplace else for a while, but maybe I want them back because we've invested in them. And have I set the stage for that? And then do I have the infrastructure and the policies to support this work? So for me, to get those seats replaced with more diverse faces, it's a lot more work than just this position is vacant, let me recruit and hire the diverse talent.
I have a question, and I feel like this question could trigger a future conversation, or even a future entire series. So as I think back to our conversation today, I feel that it took place entirely within the outline of an organization internally. But here's what I have in mind, irrespective of what programs and values we drive inside the organization, there are external realities that do not support us in our internal DEIB mission. There's this wonderful story about a DEIB program in Southeast Asia that was incredible in principle and intention, but it failed completely because the most resistant stakeholder group for female potential leaders were their mothers-in-law, who perceived that they would, go into a very unbalanced, life work situation. So my question is, can you think of anything that can take inclusive leadership outside of the bubble of the organization and have a more holistic systemic impact than just within the organization?
I'm curious how we take it outside of the organization when we haven't gotten it right inside the organization.
Yeah.
Look, I holistically believe this is not a challenge that we solve as any one individual, as any one company. This isn't a competitive advantage. This is a community opportunity. And I think we do that collaboratively. But the question is framed, and I love it. And in fact, I'm working on a project right now that will bring community together to have conversations and to support each other's DEI initiatives. So fundamentally, I believe in what you're saying. But when you're now asking us to and I do believe the way to drive that kind of change in community is for corporations to invest and do that. The challenge, Manola, is they're not investing even internally. We can't get it right internally. So I don't think we're ready to do that. I do think when we get it right internally, it will change how people see things. And then, that mother-in-law is kind of like, because quite frankly, if you're talking about a dimension of diversity, you are probably talking about giving some flexibility to working moms and letting them have a career and be able to take care of their families. And then that mother-in-law is like, oh, wait a minute, this is a different way of working. It is the recalibration of work, which is a whole different session that I believe we need to have. I also think that when companies are looking at their initiatives, instead of us benchmarking against everyone else, we need to look at what works within our companies, within our regions, within our cultural dynamics, within our cities, aligned with our organizational values. But those are all things that we have to take into consideration. I would love to get there, but I think we got to clean up our own houses before we can even have that conversation.
So I'll add a little bit of what I've seen and even with DEI and from that perspective and how we're going from the inside out and kind of bringing that outside in, right? Part of, we may not be necessarily the evangelizers, right? Like we're doing it all right and we've gotten it all perfect. And I would say that for ADM is early in its journey. It has some legacy behind this 120-year-old company. There's a lot that needs to be, that we're building and we're doing and looking at internally, and all this reflection that's happening and how we're building and really implementing strategies around DEI that other companies may say, well, we've been doing that for the longest time, right? Where have y'all been? But what I can say is that as we're building on the inside, we're also looking at what those investments we can make to help support DEI outside. And that comes through our philanthropy. What organizations are we contributing to? How are we helping to build? How are we helping to build if we need to look at our recruitment strategy and we're saying, well, the availability just isn't there currently for this, that, or these types of roles. What are we doing to make that better? How are we contributing to STEM in underrepresented communities? How are we building women and their businesses to be able to become suppliers for ADM at some future state? How are we supporting those that, even though we might not be in the position to specifically support policy, but how are we supporting organizations that are impacting advocacy for policy that is equitable in communities? So as we look at it holistically, and Rocky, you made an earlier point about just bringing other parts of the organization, L&D, talent management, your recruitment, your talent acquisition, you also look at it holistically to what are we also doing within our supplier diversity? What are we doing within our philanthropic, for those of us that have those aspects within our company? And how can we become more intentional about making sure that it's a full circle rather than kind of like this triangle that we're kind of like, okay, we're pulling in and then it hits certain points instead of cycling through, because we know that this is all cyclical. There is never going to be that kind of mecca. We've reached the point of that top of the triangle, the top of the mountain, because there's going to be environmental things that happened, the pandemic pulled all kinds of women out of the workforce, right? It took us several years to now get back to the point where women are back in the workforce at the point that they were pre-pandemic. But we experienced a hit during those first 3 years during the pandemic, right? So it was hard to get women into particular roles, into the workforce. So looking at it from a cyclical perspective and what we can do to contribute to that, whether that be through volunteerism and encouraging and allowing volunteerism of our employees to contribute externally and bringing that back in, because that it all goes full cycle to the way that our colleagues and our employees are feeling about the company and feeling about what we're doing externally as well. Mm-hmm. So I would say definitely we may not lift ourselves up as here's the example and we're doing it great, but we have a responsibility to make sure that we're contributing to kind of build it from the outside as well.
Thank you, Jeanette. Evelyn, what would you add?
These ladies hit it spot on. I'm a firm believer that, there is so much that needs to be done internally before we start looking externally. But I also, to Jeanette's point, think it has to be done simultaneously because it is a constant cycle. And so I do believe in what we call community care. And from an organization, what does that look like and how can you contribute? And that varies based on, the organization, the size, the region and where you're at. But I would wholeheartedly say investment in the community for any organization is always a positive outcome internally for the organization as well.
Thank you all so very much. This was a way too short hour. And I will say goodbye in just 1 minute. A huge thank you to everybody in the audience, either now live or later on in the recording. A 20-second mic drop wrap-up round. If you were to define inclusive leadership in one word, don't say more words quickly so that it counts for one word. Been there, done that, doesn't work. One word, inclusive leadership in one word. And what we will do, we will go counterclockwise. Jeanette, one word. I'm sure it was amazing, but you were on mute.
Self-awareness.
Thank you. Rocky.
Authentic.
Evelyn.
Empathetic.
Wonderful. Evelyn, Rocky, Jeanette. It was a joy. It was a gift spending this hour with you. Everybody in the audience, thank you. I hope I will get the chance to welcome you in about half an hour for our panels today for the Strategic HRBP Summit. If not, I will see all of you tomorrow in our October series. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Jessa. Bye.
Bye.